Hey, and welcome to episode 26 of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. I am very, very excited to have my guest on today. We're going to get to talk with Dr. Dustin Messer, and we're going to talk about Micro-Christendom and Secular Sacraments, all sorts of fun topics. I have a feeling I'll be asking him back on because we're not going to have enough time to discuss it all. But I wanted to mention off the top of the episode why I'm so excited to have him on. First, he's a pastor in Dallas. He's a pastor at All Saints Dallas. I'm from Dallas, so I love when I get to talk with pastors there. Obviously, it's changed a lot since I left in 2005, but he's doing great work in Dallas, which is my hometown, so I'm obviously interested in his ministry there. His wife went to Texas A&M, and so he has connections to Texas A&M. Big Aggie fan, at least on my side. It was hard last weekend that they lost to the Razorbacks, and that was really disappointing. And then furthermore, one of my roommates, best friends from high school, Sam Turner, goes to Dustin's church. And so I'm going to be interviewing Dustin in part today because I want to make sure Sam is getting good pastoral care. And so that's what this podcast will be about. But I'm just so glad to have him on here. If you want to follow him online, he has such a great temperament and level of engagement in terms of intellectual engagement, and just has a great sense of cultural engagement. So Dustin, I'm so glad you're here today. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Dude, Chase, it is such an honor. I'll tell you real quick, Sam is my third favorite Turner. So the first baby I ever baptized was Sam's son, Davey. And Robin, his wife, I have the distinct privilege of working with at All Saints Dallas. And then Sam is third in line, but still, that's just in Turners. But then in humanity, Sam is high up in line of favor.
That's great. I love Sam so much, and I'm so glad you're here. One of the things I was curious to know more about, and you know, we could talk as much about your story as you want to. I just think you have a really intriguing story. From what I gather, you went to Boys College, then to Covenant, and then I think either LaSalle for your PhD. Is that right? So you've gone to a Baptist college, a Presbyterian seminary, and a Catholic PhD, and now you're an Anglican priest. That's a really curious story you've got, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, if you add the Baptist school, the Presbyterian school, and the Catholic school together and divide by 3, you get an Anglican school. Now what happened, it probably on the surface looks a lot more sort of jumbled than maybe it was. I had the real distinct honor of working at a church in Louisville, Kentucky when I was at Boys College for a man named Brian Payne, who has been and remains a big mentor in my life and a very committed Southern Baptist himself, but did his doctoral work under an Anglican named Graham Goldsworthy. And he really introduced me to this evangelical Anglican stream. I remember he and I kind of our, I guess, catechesis course. We used Christianity Explored, which is developed by Rico Trice's people at in London in sort of evangelical Anglican waters. When I graduated, I actually considered going. Graham Goldsworthy teaches at Moore College in Sydney, Australia, and I really considered going to Sydney because this sort of evangelical Anglican expression really appealed to me. But Brian Payne, my sort of mentor, very much appreciated a man named Brian Chappell, who's at Covenant Seminary. And Chappell came to give some lectures at Boyce, and I wound up going there. But then as I was there, I thought to myself I would be comfortable either with a Presbyterian call or kind of an Anglican call. And the way it worked out, I wound up in the Anglican Communion, which I'm very happy for. It's been a wonderful home, as you say, at All Saints Dallas. It really is one of the most healthy expressions of not just Anglicanism, but of kind of a vibrant, life-filled congregation. And so that's the journey from Baptist to Presbyterian to Anglican.
That's beautiful. Yeah, we actually have one of Brian's kids that go to our church, and so I always joke whenever they're in the audience and I have to preach, I'm like, "Oh Lord, help me and help them," because they grew up under Brian Chappell and his preaching. Now they have to put up with my preaching. So I'm very thankful for his kind of perspective and writing on preaching. So being Anglican, I think we recently connected at the Theopolis Ministry Conference. And I'll be frank with you, that's the first time I've ever experienced that type of what did we call it? I mean, it's a liturgy, but we had
Yeah.
vespers and we had other things like that. In my mind, that was pretty high church stuff. I enjoyed it. I mean, I came back telling my wife about it and that kind of thing. If I were to come to your Anglican church, would we be going through a similar liturgy there? Is it a same feel?
Yeah, it really is. The shape of the liturgy is very similar. Our music, Peter and Theophilus really emphasizes psalm chanting, which I find really, if I'm being frank, both beautiful and daunting. I mean, it's a skill you kind of have to learn, which I want to grow in. Our music at All Saints, our worship pastor for a long time is a guy named Ryan Flanagan. He has a musical group called Liturgical Folk, so it's a bit more kind of folky type music. And so there's some differences, but the shape of the liturgy certainly would be similar, and then just the emphasis on praying the hours and not just going through time kind of mindlessly, but having time go through the church, and
Hmm.
a lot of similarities with what Peter's doing.
That's cool. Yeah, I listened to some of the chanting. Um, when I got home, I was trying to explain to people what it's like. And it can be very like, especially for kind of evangelicals at a non-denominational church like ours, it can be a little for some it's like off-putting, it's intriguing, it's also inspiring. And
Yeah,
that's what I found because I've been a missionary in Muslim context. And they do their call to prayer 5 times a day from loudspeakers basically all over the city, which gives a very haunting sense. And then I turn on these Theophilus prayers and psalms and these chanting, and I'm like, oh, like Christianity has a whole history
yeah.
that doesn't just rival Islam, but it's more potent and powerful in my estimation. And to me, I just it conjured up imagery of like, this is how Christianity shapes the world. This is how we shape, because that, and when you go over to a Muslim context, it's very total in its influence. And I'm like, wow, that's a very powerful expression of worship, and I really enjoy it. One of the things I wanted to hear more about is at LaSalle, you got a PhD. That was fairly recent, right?
Yeah, I did a doctor of theology. I graduated just this past, I guess, past spring, which was a huge relief. I went there. The guy studied under a guy named S. Joel Garver. While I was at Covenant Seminary, I had read things by Dr. Garver, and as you say, I was really interested in, Islam has a very public theology, kind of innately. There's a British monk, an Anglican monk named A.G. Hebert, who in America, the I think the way he's probably known, as far as he is known, is he was sort of J.I. Packer's foil in some Packer's work on doctrine of Scripture, because Hebert was very Anglo-Catholic, and so they were kind of natural foils. But he has a book on kind of the public theology of liturgy. And one of the things he said that really struck me, and in some ways intersects what I did at LaSalle, was he said, the church bell, like, says something to a community, which is it sort of rings over a whole village and announces that this space, like this physical space, is inviting and claimed by the church, and he just really emphasized this kind of public nature of the things the church does, and which I found really appealing. So, anyways, I went to LaSalle University, yeah, and I studied a lot of different things in my coursework, but was really interested in kind of Catholic social teaching. And then at Covenant Seminary, I did a lot of stuff with Abraham Kuyper, so I was really interested in kind of subsidiarity in Catholic social teaching, and then sphere sovereignty in Neo-Calvinism. And then I wrote a dissertation called Micro-Christendoms on a Micro-Christendom's cultural renewal on a human scale, and really just explored, like, what's the role of this public theology that the church has? How does it relate to the particularities of neighborhoods? But I had a great experience. Joel Garver is a great philosopher, and just a great Christian and person, and I had a really good experience at LaSalle.
That's great. Yeah, there's so much in there we could talk about. One of the things that you wrote on that I recently listened to an interview with you about was this idea of micro-Christendom. And so obviously that was an emphasis of yours in your dissertation. I think, well, I want to talk about Christendom first and then get into micro second. So when we hear the word Christendom, I think for some people, maybe it has a bad rap. For others, it just sounds ancient. So if you had to define Christendom, how would you define it for people?
Yeah, I guess the way I would talk about Christendom is it's the embodied institutional outworking of the Christian faith. There's just said something about neo Calvinism. There's a kind of famous neo Calvinist theologian and in some ways cultural critic named Henry Van Til, different than Cornelius Van Til. And one of the things Henry Van Til said that that's often quoted is culture is religion externalized. Um, and so Christendom is, Jesus talks about the seed of the kingdom growing into a tree, or there's a lost manuscript that talked about Jesus saying the kingdom is like a marshmallow in the microwave, expanding until it blows up in the microwave. That was a joke. Jesus really didn't say that about the marshmallow, though. Maybe he but it's slow and it's growing. It's in seed form, but there seems to be this eye in the gospel toward this tree of the kingdom, providing shelter to the birds of the world. And so Christendom is this outworking in a cultural, political way of the faith, such that our both norms are based on sort of Christian imagination and outlook, and also our laws. And you can restrict or broaden definitions of Christendom. I mean, I would point to the arguments made by someone like Martin Luther King Jr. is very much kind of Christendom informed, that says we can't keep this faith private, but that we have to work it out and embody it. It's very contested these days. I mean, as you know, there's some kind of sophisticated arguments against a Christendom mindset made by people like Stanley Hauerwas, and kind of coming from Yoder and an Anabaptist tradition. I also think there's, just kind of a knee jerk. Someone who was at Boyce College when I was there, Russ Moore, who I have a lot of respect for, Moore's always said, and I Russ Moore's maybe besides Brian Chappell, we talked about, one of the great preachers, genuinely great preacher. But I remember Moore when I was at Boyce College, always talking about just how bad cultural Christianity is.
Mm.
And I get it, because when you hear cultural Christianity, what you hear is you're qualifying Christian. So it's like not someone who's really deep down a Christian, but they're just a cultural Christian. They haven't really bought into it, but they're kind of going through life in a hypocritical way. And I think a lot of people, when they think of Christendom, they see that problem, which for sure is a real problem. I minister in Dallas, Texas, very different than Boulder, Colorado. There are a lot of cultural Christians here, people who show up on Christmas, show up on Easter. The God they don't tithe to is the Christian God. But it just strikes me that problem of cultural Christianity, when put in perspective, like what is it rivaling? What other kind of culture might one have? It just strikes me that hypocrisy is not the worst thing in the world. This is not to be glib about this, but Norm Macdonald just passed away, a couple weeks ago. He had this kind of famous joke because someone said to him, when Bill Cosby, it came out that he was a serial abuser, someone said to Norm Macdonald, the worst part of this is the hypocrisy. And he said, I think the worst part of it is the abuse. Said, in other words, had Bill Cosby been going around saying, I'm really proud of this abuse I'm doing to women, people wouldn't be like, it's not good that he's abusing women, but you guys say this for him. He's not a hypocrite. No one would say that. We all kind of intuitively know that hypocrisy is the restraining, John Calvin talks about the three uses of the law. It's the restraint of evil. And so there's something to be said for it. I mean, I want people to be really flesh and blood Christians. It's what I deeply hope. But a cultural Christianity is man, it's not the worst thing in the world. Sometimes the incentive to be a hypocrite can restrain some very serious and real evil. So I think those are the two kind of things going against Christendom right now: the intellectual sort of Anabaptist critique. I think it's kind of a general, frustration in the Bible Belt for people who, they're like, I know that guy, says he really believes, but gosh, I know he doesn't treat his family very well or whatever. He's just going through the motions. A problem, but I don't think a problem that should distract from this larger goal of embodying and institutionalizing our faith.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I've been using a phrase with some friends in ministry to say that our goal, and it's tongue in cheek, but our goal is to make more nominal Christians. And they look at me like I've got a third eye because, well, of course that's not your real goal, but a natural byproduct, if we're successful, is that more people become nominal Christians. Of course, I don't want people to become nominal Christians just for the sake of being nominal Christians. But if there are more nominal Christians, if I grew up in Dallas, and so Christianity was a norm. You went to church on these holidays and you did these things, and I despised that for a long time. Well, I can tell you now, being out of that culture and being in a non-Christianized culture, I would much rather my children be raised in that. I would much rather my children be under that umbrella or the shade of that tree, so to speak, which has its own liabilities and vulnerabilities. But I think a natural byproduct of us being effective in mission as the people of God will be creating cultures where Christianity flourishes. So yeah, I think that's a really helpful thing. I think one of the things I've struggled with is we've taught kind of Tim Keller's approach. He has an article called The Missional Church. We use it I still use it. I'm about to teach our membership class here in a couple of weeks. And we use it to help people think about, when we use the word missional, what do we mean? And, in the last few years, I've kind of realized some vulnerabilities with that. I think for a long time, Keller was on a pedestal for me. Still one of my great, influencers in my thinking, who helped mature me in a lot of ways in Christianity. But I've kind of noticed he kind of poo-poos on Christendom, or at least it's dead in his mind, right? It's kind of a lost cause. As you mentioned, kind of critiques of Christendom, how would you say he fits into kind of what you mentioned? Is it more an Anabaptist approach, or is it more like kind of a rejection of cultural Christianity?
I like you. I mean, I think we all probably owe this huge debt of gratitude to someone like Tim Keller. My understanding is someone who doesn't know Tim Keller or anything like that, is that before he named the church Redeemer Press, he wanted to go with something like Christ the King. This idea that Christ claims lordship, rule. Keller has a very, especially early on, but I think probably still does, very influenced by sort of neo-Calvinist, Kuyperian. I mean, influenced by Van Til. If you read his apologetics, this is not fashionable to be a Van Tilian right now. I mean, Keller really is sort of a modified. You had John Frame on not that long ago, a modified Van Tilian in something like a John Frame way. So I wouldn't put Keller in the Anabaptist camp. I just saw the other day said some stuff about two kingdom theology, very favorably, not radical two kingdom theology. So, anyways, I don't know exactly what his critique of Christendom would be exactly. My suspicion, the missional crowd has often made a pragmatic argument that may be right, which is the institutions of the old Christendom are sort of not worth protecting. In other words, they've become they're already post-Christian. And so it's sort of just a knee-jerk reaction for a Christian in 1980 or 1990 to, cling to this or that organization or political party. You sort of assume, well, that's the Christian way to go. And I know a lot of missional folks talk about, that's they have the guise, or sort of they're gilded with Christian language, but deep down we have to sort of have the sophistication to understand that they're being used like pawns in some other political game. So I understand that. I guess what I would say is however Tim Keller would articulate this, I've been to Redeemer Pres before. It is doing a Christendom project. It does have a big public theology. You look at their diaconal ministry, it is rivaling the state in New York. I mean, it's incredible. It really is a model. It's everything Ron Dreher says about the Benedict option. I mean, in some ways, Redeemer Pres is doing in terms of their diaconal ministry and sort of having an institutionalized a view of the faith. I guess my critique back to the missional community might be something like, we're so interested in sending our people out to redeem. Well, number one, what does success look like? If I get that we need to be able to go into an office environment that's hostile to our faith and kind of just know how to manage and get along. But if everybody in the office were Christians, what would a good office be like, or what would a neighborhood be like? So that's one thing. Another thing is, I just think there needs to be something of an emphasis on the formation of people, and I think Rod Dreher has done had some helpful insights on this, that we have to be a formed people before we are kind of sent out to do a particular thing. And I mean, I know you know these kids as well, so many kids who are sent to public schools. Not every public school is the same, even in a given city, but sent to public schools that really do just kind of drain them of life, or they're put in traveling sports leagues and taken out of church under the guise of being missional, but they never really were formed. I mean, they go to church 10 times in a year, and we think, well, it's just all about sort of going, but there does have to be a being component of the faith, just a formative, this is what we as Christians believe, in order for that missional expression to be effective. And in order for, I think a lot of the quote unquote redemption or transformation is one-sided. It's the culture changing our kids and our people, not our people changing the culture. So that would be my kind of critique back to some of the missional folks.
That's really helpful. That's something I've really wrestled with. I think part of the self kind of confessed tension I've felt is that when we set out to plant our church, the Well, we even saying it, we didn't even include the word church in our title at the time, and then our values we articulated in this way. We said we have 4 values. We still say this. I just put a lot more nuance, you might say, on them. We use the word gospel-centered, missional, and authentic. And then the last one is joyful. That's a pretty rock solid one that, I can pull that from the Bible. But the other 3 are very buzzwordy. And I've had to do a lot of remedial education, that when I say gospel centered, here's actually what I mean. When I say missional, here's actually what I mean. When I say authentic, it's not. I read Truman's book on Rise of the Modern Self, and I was like, oh man, do we just need to get rid of that value? I still think it's a helpful word, because that is what we're going for in our church. Is we want a level of vulnerability and connection relationally with others. But I have to be careful that I'm not just importing into the church things that are that you might think are value neutral. They're very value laden. That kind of gets into your topic of Micro-Christendom. So what if we've kind of already defined, you've kind of laid out a vision of what Christendom is. What is a vision for Micro-Christendom? And you kind of talked about it with the office environment, but let's use that as a springboard. How would you help the audience, or help me understand what Micro-Christendom is?
Well, so when I was doing my doctoral work, I went to some sociology just about how individuals change their surroundings and then are changed by their surroundings. And I went in, to be frank, thinking to myself, with technology, globalism, multiculturalism, and so forth, our localities probably don't shape us that much. People move a lot. We're, the people with whom we interact in a given day Oftentimes, you and I don't live near one another and so forth. So maybe our localities aren't that formative to us. And then the other thing was, since kind of moral majority style politicking, there's been this idea that if you are not going to be kind of an Anabaptist and withdraw from redeeming institutions and cultures and so forth, if you're going to try that, you really need to affect what's happening in Washington, D.C. I mean, if there's a voter guide to be handed out imminently. And so what I found in sociology is, number one, states, nations they do change, but the way in which they change, the speed at which they change, the consequences of the change, very complex. Oftentimes, the intentionality behind one person trying to change a nation and the way the nation changes, there's not a lot of correlation there. So what that told me was there are a lot of very well-meaning, earnest people who want to live out and apply their faith. We talked about Peter Lightheart in his lovely book on Traces of the Trinity. He says, in order to show hospitality, transformation has to happen. In other words, if you invite a hungry person into your home and you don't change their identity as a hungry person, if they don't leave a fed person, you haven't showed hospitality. You've just sort of occupied the same space as them.
Mm-hmm.
He applies this to how we minister to those with severe addictions, all sorts of things. In order to show hospitality, there has to be an element of transformation. There are a lot of people who want to transform institutions, and I want to laud that. But then I just see, man, we're spending a lot of effort on national politics. And then what I realized with a lot of the sociology, a lot of good stuff at the University of Chicago, showing that actually our neighborhoods still have a huge effect on us, and a relatively few amount of people have the ability to transform and change, affect their immediate surrounding, their HOA, their neighborhood, even their cities. Cities pretty large. It depends on the city you live in, obviously. So those two realizations kind of led me to make this argument that I've been making now for a couple of years, which is embrace the kind of, you could call it missional probably, but it's transformational impulse to institutionalize and embody the faith, to show hospitality, to be that tree offering birds shelter, but do it at the local level primarily. National politics certainly have their place, but primarily do it at the local level. And in so doing, we can have a huge impact on our neighbors, and we can say more about that. But that's basically the argument, is that micro-Christendoms is a way to, if you like, give, like the Benedict option, a public theology. What does this look like? So what is the Benedict option? Sort of huddling together for, intentional Christian formation in this kind of liturgical way. Well, what does the public life of those people look like? A lot of it presumes, I think, a hostile to the faith national culture. And I think there is a way to say, well, DC and Hollywood are hostile to us, therefore I'm not going to try to embody the faith. And my argument is that indeed you can, but perhaps the local level is the outlet to channel those kind of missional energies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so compelling to me because we live in, I don't know if they're the most polarized times, but they are very polarized times. And it can be easy to think when you engage in the public square that you're going to encounter a lot of resistance and hostility. And you should expect that. I mean, that's what Jesus promised us, is that we're going to experience hostility. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the offense of the cross is offensive to people. Yet at the same time, what I found is when I'm open and upfront with who I am, my identity as a pastor, and what we're trying to do, and inviting people to church, most people, they're not out to try to crucify me. They're
Yeah.
actually very willing to engage, even if it is they're a bit apathetic. When you move to a place like Boulder, I think in our mind when we planted, we anticipated more hostility. You would imagine it to be, since it is so, I mean, secular in the truest word, and left, you would expect to encounter a lot of resistance, and we've encountered that. We've had conversations where you as soon as you say yeah, we're here, we're with a church, and literally the person won't even finish the conversation, they just walk away from you. And
Mhm.
so it's less like outward hostility, it's more apathy.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people are either scared to just kind of out themselves as a Christian. That was one of our emphases in the last few years as a church, is like, we just want you to like let somebody know that you're praying for them. Like just offer to pray for somebody. That can be scary for a lot of Christians in a culture like ours, because they're like, well, then they'll assume things about what I believe, or and it's like, yeah, well, you really can't control that, but we do need to be hospitable people, showing the love of Jesus to people. And most people are actually pretty open, especially in a spiritual place. I mean, spiritual in quotes, uh, place like Boulder, where people are curious about spirituality. People are interested to explore more, and we've seen time and time again, we've made great inroads into relationships where I'll get texts from people that don't go to our church, that say they do, that aren't Christians, that call me one of their best friends, and I'm like, wow, okay, well, we're doing something right. Um, so I think it's a really cool vision. It helps me articulate. Would you, for a church leader like myself, if I'm trying to cast this vision that you've kind of shared and shaped in your dissertation to people, do you find that when you say, "Hey, All Saints Dallas, we're trying to create a micro-Christendom," is that the way you would articulate it, or how would you articulate it to your church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess the honest answer is I don't know that I've ever used the expression of micro-Christendom in a sermon or anything like that. Probably talking about when we were at Theopolis, there was a good seminar given on hospitality. I do think there's a way to talk about some of this in terms of neighborliness and hospitality. Again, with this emphasis on showing hospitality involves transformation. Um, I at Covenant Seminary, there's the ethics professor. I guess he's vice president or something now, but Dan Doriani has a really good book on application and preaching. I think one of the sort of necessary but not sufficient components for what I would want church leaders to do is really a revival of application and preaching. Brian Chappell, who we've said so many great things about, who I have so much respect for, really helped us think through preaching as not just imperative, do this, do that, but as indicative, what is true of you, telling the story of Scripture and so forth. That's so important. But I think that has been recovered, and now there's probably a need for an emphasis on, so how do you live out your faith? Like the God justification is something that God does, right? But sanctification is something that you live out of, and Chapel would totally say this too, that the imperatives come out of the, excuse me, the indicatives come out of the imperative. Um, how do we live out this faith? So I think one thing a church leader could do is, as they're preaching on a text about, one who doesn't care for his family is worse than an unbeliever. You could make the application point that, you may see a commercial on TV about this or that sort of tragedy all over the world. And if you give a few dollars to this or that cause, it may alleviate some of the guilt you have. But in Scripture, you aren't held responsible for every tragedy that happens. There's who's my neighbor. There's like a circle around you, a circle of responsibility, such that if you allow your second cousin to go hungry tonight, that's a little bit worse than allowing, someone in your church to go hungry, maybe, or something like that. But then it gets worse if it's your mom, it gets even worse if it's your wife, it gets really, really bad if it's your baby. It's not just that we're all sort of held responsible for injustice. So the way you apply that is you talk about, how do you care for and attend your actual sphere of influence? Like, to whom are you actually responsible? And how can you live this faith out? So I think making application to your neighborhood, your workplace is really important. And I think Dan Duran actually says in his book on application, there actually aren't, if you like Google application preaching, there aren't a ton of books written on application and preaching. It was something very important to certainly the Puritans, but even the Reformers, was how do you live out the faith? I think that the modern evangelical church has a lot of sort of, there's either a lot of deep theology, or a lot of sort of pious, therapeutic type preaching, but not a lot of kind of just, how do you just live your life and be a normal human who's attractive to people who are really lost and hurting and dying and so forth. So that would be one thing for sure I would do. And then I would just encourage people to have eyes to see something called the broken window theory you're probably familiar with, which basically ways to critique it, but basically says order in a neighborhood breeds order, disorder breeds disorder. I do think that there can be opportunities for intentional training of how to partner with signs of order in a neighborhood, and then how to sort of combat disorder. I think that sort of thing is important and could have a place in sort of the actual church life.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. The application of preaching, it's been a bit of a conundrum, especially early on in my preaching. Because I was newly reformed, you might say. I was in that reformed cage phase. And so a lot of my preaching was very esoteric,
Yeah.
pontificating on how great God is, which he is, no doubt. But I would get critiques and people would say, where's the application? And then I would, you know, kind of dance around and be like, why do you care about application? We need to care about God's glory. And it's like, well, of course, Chase. I've since then in the last few years kind of a turn in my own preaching. And so I look forward to kind of checking out that Dan Doriani resource that you mentioned, just because it is so important. As I study the Puritans, I discover it's not. I think they have a reputation of being what some of my peers might call legalistic. It's not so much legalistic; it's application, and they're just trying to flesh out the faith for their congregation, which is so key. One of the works you've written, I can't recall how many books you've written. I know that you've written Secular Sacraments. Is that a recently published work, or was that published before your dissertation, or when was that published?
Yeah, it was before the dissertation. It was there's a kind of a think tank called the Center for Cultural Leadership. It's run by Andrew Sandlin. We mentioned John Frame. John Frame is a fellow there. Some really good friends of mine, Brent Mattson, David Bonson. I'm a senior fellow there. Center for Cultural Leadership, Andrew Sandlin sort of published a collection of my essays to do with, I guess you could say, so it's called Secular Sacraments. And the idea is sort of, even in a secular world, glimpses of this deep longing for transcendence and so forth. So those essays were published on Christianity Today and the Gospel Coalition, and I'm a columnist at the Colson Center Breakpoint. A lot of Breakpoint stuff was in there. And I guess the emphasis of that, it was a couple of years ago, was I think sort of the doctrinal crises of our day is anthropology. And in fact, I think a lot of the critiques of Christendom come from a really malnourished view of just what a human is, a lot of the talk of like systemic injustice, for instance, I think presumes that in a state of nature, man is born free, but everywhere finds himself in chains. That in a state of nature, left alone, man would choose the right thing. That we are sort of inherently good, righteous people. So if you find instances of injustice, well, it can't be the individual. It therefore must be some sort of collective, systemic, pusher of the injustice. Now, I think there's systemic injustice for sure. I mean, there certainly can be instances, but in those instances, I tend to think that it's the system not holding back injustice. So it's like, in a society where people sort of have tamed these worst impulses, you need fewer laws. I mean, this is just kind of a given that I think any reasonable person can see, that in a moral society, you need fewer laws, but it's like a dam. As holes start to break, you need more and more patches, and these laws are patches and so forth. And so in those essays, what I tried to do is just say, man is actually like sinful. Like we have this, like what God in scripture says about humanity is experientially true. It's something we all kind of know intuitively in our own heart, is that, man, we want evil. We wish ill against people. You know, a 2-year-old is super cute, but if a 2-year-old had the strength of like a grown man, he would kill you in your sleep. You know, I mean, 2-year-olds are totally depraved, right? Not utterly depraved, but they are totally depraved. If that's the case, I think then you say to yourself, okay, so you have a Christian culture, a culture that's really governed and shaped by the norms of Christianity. Then you point to instances of injustice there. Well, if you have a proper sort of anthropology, it leads you to say, okay, so those things are bad that are happening, but it's not necessarily caused by the Christian faith. You kind of assume, you enter into any society, if you have a proper anthropology thinking, well, man is going to do awful things. Man is going to beat and chain, enslave, do awful things to man. The question is, what system is going to restrain those impulses the most and highlight, because in addition to having depravity, we also have immense dignity. You know, Genesis 1 comes from Genesis 3. And what system is going to really spotlight and shine the dignity of man? Well, that anthropology is how you sort of navigate politics. You aren't just going to say, well, look at this Christian culture, here are these bad things, therefore the whole system itself must be overthrown. Then you kind of just say to yourself, okay, so the Christian system has problems, but problems are kind of a given. It also has these immense benefits. Now let's compare it to Islamic culture. Let's compare it to humanistic cultures. Let's compare it to all these different things. All of them are going to have badness in them, but which one promotes the most good? And when you do that, when you have like this proper anthropology, I think what you'll see is that, man, all Christians have done awful things, no question. But Christianity institutionalized has led to immense human dignity. I mean, I just have a really hard time, you know, throwing the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, over William Wilberforce over and so forth. So those essays, what I've tried to do is make this argument that anthropology, who we are as people, will sort of shine through. You know, I mean, we are who we are, even if we try to deny it. And I tried to apply that to culture and TV and politics and things like that. And Andrew Sandlin was super nice to collect and publish that, and I think it's still available on Amazon.
Okay, cool. That's great. I love that you touched on anthropology, especially it's one of my favorite topics of research. Theological anthropology is there's a deep well there, and modernism and postmodernism really are a dehumanizing framework. As much good as we have in the world, as much technology and advancement and progress and economic capital, it can lead us to make conclusions about ourselves and others that are just so dehumanizing. And it's why I want to. That's what I'm applying to get a PhD, and it's going to be a focus of my research is Puritan theological anthropology, because especially back then, almost pre-modern, I want to understand how they thought of people and how they should be formed, and then how that should then shape society, specifically in New England. And so,
Yeah.
it's a hugely important thing, and the topic of the image of God is really relevant to that. I forget. I know where the book is. It's up there. Destined for Dignity and Destiny by John Kilner. He wrote on theological anthropology, and he talks about the image of God. It's really helpful because in theological anthropology, there's a lot of literature. I mean, the reformers wrote on it. So many people have written on it. Augustine and lots of church history on theological anthropology. But particularly with the image of God, it seems that it's an overbuilt doctrine. And what I mean by that is there's a sense where we throw that term around a lot when it's mentioned 3 times in the Bible in very specific ways. And what we as moderns typically like to do is we like to situate the image of God in a particular capacity or thing that we can control.
Mm.
And when we do that, we inherently will lead not only a heretical problem, a theological problem, but it's a sinful problem because we end up treating other people in really horrific ways. I mean, it's the reason the Nazis were able to dehumanize others and murder others is because they situated the image of God in really atrocious ways. And so I think a recovery of being made in God's image which ultimately Christ is the image of God, and being made in his image can be a really helpful antidote to a lot of the ills in our world, and can be a really compelling witness if I can figure out a way to articulate that in a way that's not so academic and highfalutin, for people, where it's like, hey, you're much more than what you do. You're much more than what you think. You're much more than your sin. You're destined for so much more than that. And the only way to that destiny is in Christ. It's just such a rich doctrine that I think needs to be rediscovered by a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that you're going to focus on that, because I do think that's the question of our day. There's a sense in which I think, actually, Tim Keller has written really helpfully on this, that um, there is a way to use catechesis that kind of avoids the actual issues of our day. In other words, like the reformers very easily could have just said, well, look, we all agree on doctrine of God or something. But no, they really pushed home justification. And I do think, likewise, there is a sense in which we could talk about being gospel centered, which, my goodness, I hope that we are. But there is a sense in which we could just talk about sort of justification all day long and not address sort of the elephant in the room, which is this anthropological question of what sort of creature are we? What is our sex? What is our, everything? And I think as pastors and just Christians generally have a clear note on this is what it means to be human. I think people are actually, like you said, I mean, friends in Boulder, people are kind of long to know, because it's like they're trying on these ill-fitting clothes of modernity that says you can be whatever you want to be. And man, I just find that people are really getting that those clothes are ill-fitting. And so helping pastors think through what is man is going to be a really important, I think, apologetic task for the church.
For sure. Kind of closing out, if we had to summarize because the title Secular Sacrament, now that I understand it better, it's a collection of essays. The word sacrament, I'll use interchangeably with ordinance because I'm more Baptistic, and I try to get my categories correct on that stuff, and I want to honor the history of sacramental theology. At the same time, I'm curious to know from your perspective, when you think of secular sacraments, if somebody was like, what would be an example of a secular sacrament? How would you help them understand what that might be?
Yeah, and I'm totally with you there. I mean, I think there are two proper sacraments as well, I'm fine calling them ordinances or whatever, baptism and the Lord's Supper. There's a sense, actually, and it was great on this, is Jonathan Edwards. There's a sense in which, however, that the world is sacramental. And this just goes to Romans 1, that if we talk about sacrament as sort of being revelatory, a sign of something else, right? So the world, we are meant to read. It's not just meant to sort of sit there, but it is a speech act. It's Heidelberg Catechism, or I think it's Heidelberg. It's probably wrong, but talks about, that creation are words of God, and that, like, scripture, the idea is helps us read those words in sort of the right order. So that's how I'm using sacramental, not necessarily about baptism and the Lord's Supper. So I guess an example, this is an article I wrote for Christianity Today about the Magic School Bus. And the Magic School Bus, the new kind of Netflix TV show. In the Magic School Bus, creation is viewed like you go into creation, you explore it, it's grand, it causes awe. No kid or teacher in the Magic School Bus, like Mrs. Frizzle, never cuts open nature and just sort of shows it as a brute fact. It's always this mysterious created thing. And I kind of compared and contrasted Bill Nye the Science Guy and the way he teaches kids about nature, which is very much sort of a dissectable thing, a collection of component parts. And so, I don't think the creators of the Magic School Bus are Christian. I don't know, they may be. But it's an example of, we intuitively know, I think this is true, that every language in the world, our word for creation has this counterpart of creator. So in other words, brute nature is actually how no one actually looks at the world, we all intuitively know that there is a God. I mean, that's just straight Romans 1. And so if that's the case, then we shouldn't be surprised that non-believers even will paint a picture of the world that is true in that way. So that was one example off the top of my head. I talked about the magic school bus. I tried to go through and just sort of see cracks in sort of the secular zeitgeist where this true Christian view of the world nevertheless sort of broke through.
That's great. Well, I'm curious about something, and I don't think it would necessarily be prudent for us to delve into it too much with the limited time we have because we're kind of wrapping up here. I read an article yesterday, and I'll drop it in the show notes for anyone who's listening. And it was exploring the idea that a lot of the way that our world is treating our current medical crisis, the virus, um, a lot of the way the discourse and language around the vaccine, it is as if it is a sacrament of purification. Now, obviously, I at least wouldn't want to discourage the use of medicine or anything like that. And this guy in this article does not either. He's very clear that vaccines are useful, helpful, and effective. So it's not a question of the efficacy. It's more of a question of how it's being framed widespread. There was a funny and it's a sad kind of funny. There was a clip with Stephen Colbert, who I used to enjoy his humor a lot more when I was in college, and yet the other night it was like this vaccine dance he was doing, and somebody put out a clip comparing it to kind of these making fun of both megachurch culture, with praise and worship bands, but also then side by side with this dance. And it kind of was insightful in the sense that I get the sense that for some people who don't know God, this vaccine is more than just a vaccine to them. It's a thing of deliverance. Is that what do you think?
Yeah.
Have you sensed that?
Oh, absolutely. And it gets to the anthropology thing. We are religious beings. This isn't like something special about the vaccine. We're religious beings. Purity and impurity are like categories very deep in our head. And those sort of impulses well, first of all, they can either be right or wrong. They also either be channeled helpfully and well or channeled unhelpfully. But we're religious beings, and I don't think it should surprise us that we will take any given thing and we will sort of form sects around it. So again, I think having, the way we get secularism is, this isn't going to surprise you, but you have paganism, which is very parochial in the sense of like, it's regional. There's a lot of tribes. That's the natural state of man, is tribal, regional, hostile. Babies identify more with the face of their mother than someone else. Like, we're just born that way, tribal, insular people. The Jewish faith says, no, they're in the Old Testament. No, God is not a regional God. This is why Jonah can't run away from God, right? God is in the depths of the sea, but that Yahweh created everything, land, sky, sea, birds, fish, everything, and he rules over everything. Then in the New Testament, we have Jesus saying, and everybody, just regardless of nationality and so forth, can know the living God. This is hugely opens up faith. I mean, it breaks down tribes, tongues, and nations. And then you get secularism, which is trying to keep that inclusiveness, but throw away Christ, who banished these tribal gods, right? And I think what we're seeing now is the erosion of the secular order and the reappearance of a pagan order. And what I mean by that isn't just sort of a new agey belief in many gods, though that may accompany it, but tribal identifications, and a retreat from this inclusive gospel message that shaped the West, and a reversion back to a tribal thing. And then discrete objects, artifacts, things like that, like the vaccine, will be used to further purify this tribe from that tribe. And we'll just increasingly find politics and this sort of thing becoming a religion. And it genuinely is. I mean, I don't want to sound like my hair's on fire because I'm a pretty hopeful person, but that outlook for the West that rejects Christ is going to be far less inclusive and far less humane than Christendom, for its faults, which no doubt there were. As I said, this new order is, I think, going to reverse a lot of the assumptions of the West for the past 50 years.
Yeah, I sense that as well, and I think that's a great way to close out. Not because it's sad, but just because I want to circle back to what I said at the beginning. I love how hopeful you are, and I think that your micro-Christendom view, whether we want to call it that from the pulpit or not, or just apply it, I think it's really helpful. I can be a person who's a bit more negative. My friends and my family know that, a bit more of a cynic, and so that's what I love about Dustin. You should go check out his work. Obviously, well published, and just a really helpful guy. Thank you so much for spending time with me talking about this stuff today. It's been illuminating for me, and if it's illuminating for me, I know it's going to be illuminating for other people. So thanks for being with me this morning.
Thank you, Chase. I really appreciate this podcast, and it was a real joy to be on with you this morning.
For sure, man. All right. Well, you can always pick up Dustin's work at Amazon, Secular Sacraments. You can find his work online. Check out his sermons. All Saints visit his church down there. We will be back with you next week, probably doing a one-off, or still trying to get a couple guests lined up. This is a week-by-week show, and so I'll just text like I texted Dustin this week, and I was like, "Hey, let's chat this week." Not a high production; it's in my basement, and so share this episode with other people if you enjoyed it. Give us a great review. And really start a conversation. That's kind of the goal of the podcast, is start conversations so that we can know God more, love our neighbor more. But thanks so much for spending time with us, and we will see you next time.